Okay, Jody, are you introducing or should we just go ahead? Okay, we are on to the third session from LCT North America. And I see we've got all of our participants here. I'm going to start off. I am Carol Chapelle. And my, oops, I need to go to my first page here. My presentation is called Investigating Development of EFL Teachers' Situational, Technological, Pedagogical Content Knowledge. And EFL means English as a Foreign Language. The context I'm working in is an online global course for in-service EFL teachers. It's called Using Educational Technology in the English Language Classroom. And it's a professional development course for English language teachers around the world. It's 8 modules. It's an asynchronous course with live teachers and mentors, and it's sponsored by the U.S. Department of State as part of their online professional English network. The purpose is to develop teachers' knowledge and skills for using technology in their English language teaching. And we call this situational, technological, pedagogical content knowledge. And so TPACK is the shorthand term for the last 4 words of that expression. In a word, TPACK has a history in the education literature, starting with the recognition and kind of the need to understand pedagogical content knowledge. My slide here is just meant to express the fact that this idea has been around for a long time. Technology has been added to it, language has been added to it, and now in 2020, it keeps getting more and more complex. In our particular context, our situational knowledge is extremely complex because it means many different things because our participants come from dozens of different countries around the world. And this is the map of where our participants for this 8-week session are currently located. But this is just one example. I mean, we've been teaching this course for years. And so as you can see, we're talking about situational knowledge in a lot of different situations. Our research goal in this project, and it's just just getting started, is to assess participants' situational knowledge that is taught in one module of the course. And that aspect is teaching online collaborative writing. And to do that, we're exploring the use of specialization codes to theorize the knowledge of interest. We're following Jody Martin's lead here and Karen Wolf and her team. And I think what I'm going to talk about here follows on what Karen and her team talked about this morning. My academic area, though, is applied linguistics. And just to quickly say a word about applied linguistics, if we go to any of the major sources in this area, they'll define applied linguistics as a field that researches language-related problems that arise in the real-world contexts where languages are learned and used. So in other words, applied linguistics works with situational knowledge. If we put it on the specialization code in the epistemic plane, it tries to produce situational insights or knowledge practices that are specialized by their problem situations, which may be addressed through a range of approaches. And in fact, applied linguists do draw on a range of approaches. Applied linguists can draw upon purist, doctrinal, or knower insights, or some combination of those. It's really problem focused. In our pedagogy for the global online course, in fact, we try to draw on purist and knower knowledge to help the participants build their situational, technological, pedagogical content knowledge. And in this context, the knower knowledge, the knower input to their developing knowledge is absolutely critical. We don't have now, we the experts don't have knowledge of all those different contexts around the world. And so we're trying to help them to put knowledge that we're providing for them, that we're teaching them, into use in their own situations. We really need the knower knowledge. So our pedagogy for doing that is to first teach the technical knowledge about linguistics and language learning to motivate online collaborative writing pedagogy. Okay. From there, we try to develop knowledge through the experience of participation in an online collaborative writing activity. Okay, so in this activity, we put the participants into teams and actually have them work through a collaborative writing activity where they need to produce something with their group of participants in different locations. And then we assess participants' description of how they apply their knowledge to their own teaching context. Okay, and that's where we hope to see the situational insight. So we start here, just to map this back to the epistemic plane. We start here teaching the insight about linguistics, etc. And we want to end here with the insight about how to design online collaborative writing for their own students. To do this, we need to step down into the social plane in order to develop their cultivated gaze through the actual practice, through the interaction with one another during an actual simulated collaborative writing process. So our research question just initially, because remember we're looking at the assessments, is there evidence in the assessment for the success of our pedagogy for building situational TPACK? Okay, and so here we're just looking to see what the students actually write about when we ask them to write about this. In other words, do participants describe if and how they would use the online collaborative writing task in their classes? So here's the task that we set for them for the assessment. And I'm just going to look at some examples from this third part that I have highlighted there, which asks them, based on your individual experience, what would you do and not do when assigning a collaborative writing experience for your own students? Okay, so it asks them very directly, in your situation, based on your experience in the course. Okay, so what do they say? Here are just a few examples where they do make reference to what they will do, and sometimes with particular reference given to their situation. For example, I will make sure to give them enough time, as not everyone has access to the internet 24/7. What I would not like to provide my students with is assigning the roles. Better they work together so that they build interpersonal relationships without waiting for their classmates when the latter will accomplish their task. Okay, so there's a little that says what you had us do wouldn't work in my setting because we gave them roles. My task would be to create a made-up story so we could read it during class. I would give them some new vocabulary to include in the story. Something that I would probably change is to assign this task for a short period of time so students can work together for 30 or 40 minutes. So students can communicate via video calls or chat. In fact, this activity will be for an online class. Okay, so refers specifically to the situation. I probably wouldn't assign many different roles. After my experience working on a collaborative task, I have found out that most of the members end up making all kinds of contributions, not necessarily those related to their role. And finally, I will try to spot students who, just like I did, do not contribute to the draft. Okay, so based on the experience. So based on this, we saw that specialization codes work well to theorize the targeted situational knowledge that we're interested in and allow us to look more carefully at the pedagogy. Performance on the assessment reveals that many participants describe the situational knowledge okay, or at least make some reference to it. So for our next steps, we want to identify the specific aspects of situational TPACK. Okay, so what do they talk about? Access to the internet, the need to do the task in a shorter amount of time, et cetera. So what are those? So we can start to learn a bit more about the situations that they're in as we continue to revise the course. We also want to analyze the participants' descriptions of their experience in developing this the cultivated gaze by revealing links between their experience and their description showing their situational TPACK. And if we go back to the prompt asks them for this. And so we have these data. It asks them to start out by describing their role in the activity and then to give an evaluation of their experience before they actually talk about their own plans for using this. Okay, so in that first part, there's much more information that we have about their process of developing the cultivated gaze through interaction. And then we will be able to link that to the situational insight that we find in the texts. Okay. So overall, I think this has helped us to understand what we're trying to do with our epistemic knowledge building and the extent to which our assessment is revealing that. So I will end it there just by thanking all my data producers, harvesters, analysts in the Online Humanities Learning Project at Iowa State and affiliates, and especially to the LCT North America work group. And then I'm sending it over to Jason.
You're on mute, Jason.
Okay, you can hear me now? Okay, good. All right, so my name is Jason Wise, and I'm going to talk about my dissertation research today, focusing on making visible what a writing program values, a case study of first-year writing teachers across 200 level courses. And so I just finished analyzing data. So this research or analysis with LCT4K is very preliminary. So I would just like to get your feedback and connect with you on that. So what's first year writing? It's a required general education course or courses in most 2- and 4-year universities. The goal is to prepare students for college level writing and research in disciplines and careers. Pedagogically, it focuses on developing writing processes and research skills while learning to produce writing for various rhetorical situations. The field of rhetoric and composition or writing studies has developed from the course, and it's taught mainly by part-time adjunct faculty and teaching assistants without extensive training in the field. So the goal of my study is it's an embedded multiple case study to explore what teachers value in interpreting and enacting a writing program curriculum across the university's 200 level writing courses. So the data includes 2 90-minute focus groups and the crafting of 4 case studies with individual interviews with 4 teachers. A major focus is on including the missing voices of writing teachers, which is often missing from the scholarship, developing professional learning opportunities for those teachers, and that's where LCT comes in as well, making the basis of achievement more accessible by analyzing values underpinning the 200 level course. So in my context, the Gen Ed writing program is a 2-course sequence, a 100 level English composition course focusing on generalized writing and research skills, and then a 200 level course in students' sort of general disciplines with extensive academic writing and research. So there's an academic writing course in the humanities, one in writing business, education, and social sciences, and a technical writing course. They all share a similar curriculum, course structure, and student learning outcomes that are closely aligned with the WPA outcome statement for first year writing. This is a consensus statement by people in the field of writing studies, and it has 4 outcomes at the moment: rhetorical knowledge, critical thinking, reading and composing, processes, and knowledge of conventions. My theoretical framework, first of all, my philosophical framework is drawing on Bhaskar's critical realism. It helps me conceptualize writing programs as a stratified open system where knowledge, values, curriculum, and policies emerge across the writing program. And I hope to incorporate aspects of LCT as an explanatory framework, specifically with the need to see knowledge as an object of study and differentiating forms of knowledge and their effects, providing dynamic tools for visualizing knowledge practices, and providing access to that knowledge for teachers and students. My organizational framework, I'm using the epistemic pedagogic device, Mayton's expansion of Bernstein's pedagogic device, which views social fields as an arena of struggle with these three fields of production, where new knowledge is created, recontextualization, where knowledge is selected and arranged and transformed into pedagogic discourse, and reproduction, sites of teaching and learning. So instantiating that in my research, the field of production is writing studies scholarship. The field of recontextualization is the outcomes and curriculum, and reproduction, the 200 level teachers. So this is useful in analytically distinguishing between different fields and sites that are often conflated, like scholarship and curriculum and pedagogy. And it highlights a movement in both directions, emphasizing teachers' agency and professional knowledge, which is often downplayed, and focusing on knowledge making and how teachers impact the curriculum and scholarship. So I'm toying with the specialization right now and zooming in with the 4K model. So we know that knowledge practices can be divided into social and epistemic relations, while social relations can be further divided into interactual relations of knowing and subjective relations to knowers, and epistemic relations can be divided into discursive relations between knowledge and other knowledges, and ontic relations between practices and objects of study. So I think Carol does a much better job of sort of visualizing this kind of model, but we have the epistemic plane sort of in the knowledge code, focusing on insights, and the social plane in the knower, zooming into the knower code, focusing on gazes. And I'll just kind of introduce that how I need to. But when we're looking at the field of production, writing studies, scholarship, it often seems to be legitimated by a doctrinal insight focusing on an approach and downplaying ontic relations. So the field of writing studies is continually redefining itself. It's eclectic, fragmented, post-disciplinary. Zooming in as far as we can go, the field has seen a lens shift from an ontic lens, focusing on objects of study, focusing on great rhetorical works like Aristotle and Plato, and the rhetorical figures, empirical studies of writing, to now much more of a discursive lens, studies of studies. That's really a good example of that is the writing about writing approach to pedagogy, where proponents argue we should do away with first-year writing as learning writing skills, and it should be an introduction to the field of writing studies itself. Continuing with this, there's this notion of conceptual indeterminacy. The field is leaving concepts vaguely defined as a political economic advantage. So the key terms are elastic, flexible, and responsive. These terms like process, genre, context, discourse, materiality. And also borrowing on Yegan's work, there's a lot of knower building going on. With these weaker ontic relations, they can claim more and more knowledge over more and more objects of study. And that's where we get the title of the 211 textbook, Everything's an Argument, right? It's weakening the ontic relations and strengthening discursive relations. There's also this movement of foraging or importing and connecting concepts from outside of the field. This can be modeled, I think, through autonomy and recontextualization, but it's also a connecting of discursive relations, more and more approaches or concepts together. And I've often wondered how this field maintains cohesion. And one day it sort of dawned on me, it's through the approach or discursive relations, even though the field itself is very heterodox. And this approach is sort of a movement from knowledge to knowing, wherein SFL, we have really strong kind of ontic and epistemic relations for concepts like multimodality and genre. Here we have more cultivated gaze of building multimodal awareness, genre awareness, rhetorical awareness. In the field of the curriculum, we sort of have a doctrinal insight and a cultivated gaze. So the curriculum is offering an approach to research and writing while downplaying content. And this is extremely useful because this research toolkit needs to be used in 100 and 200 level courses and across all of the disciplines. So it's a good way of using this toolkit. And they also offer a cultivated gaze of offering a rhetorical lens through immersing students in course content, apprentice relationships with the teacher, feedback and peer reviews with students. So really learning through immersion and a cultivated gaze. So my question more is, how do teachers align with the fields of scholarship and curriculum? And what are the effects of the EPD on 200 level teachers? So if we look at some of the data and looking at insights first, here's an example of a teacher conceptualizing the course, again, as this sort of doctrinal insight where where research skills can be adapted to multiple contexts. The teacher says, I see the 200 level course as like a bridge between introductory first year composition, literally a bridge between that and 300 level writing. So they're focusing on how writing applies to very specific contexts, and in particular, the context they're entering into with their discipline that will follow them into their careers. I would still argue this is weaker ontic relations because they're kind of just building the toolkit that then students will have to apply in their contexts and disciplines. There's also a lot of questions about textbook and curriculum. And in this passage, teachers are talking about the fact that the technical writing textbook is stronger than the 211 humanities textbook. And it's kind of a purist insight. One teacher says, well, the textbook kind of reminds me about what Diane was saying. The writing in the sciences book that we use for 231 does a very good job of situating it in a community that you can picture and what these scientists are doing and why as they fit into parts of the research process. So I think that's a stronger ontic relations of seeing what the student, the scientists are doing. Then we have this kind of a no insight sort of come up. The same teacher then says, comparing that to the 211 textbook, which is more just like, well, rhetoric theory, the modes of argumentation that you can use for any context. And so it's a little, students are lost in the void kind of. So I think what we're seeing here is sort of the effects of the weakened ontic relations in the scholarship and curriculum provides that, well, students and teachers can be a little bit lost in that sort of context. And another teacher agrees. They said that they fully abandoned the 211 textbook. You know, it's interesting if you're going into rhetoric, but most students aren't. Most students are just trying to write a good college paper. So then another passage, a teacher is saying here how we might be able to strengthen the 100 and 200 level courses to make them more cohesive. So I kind of see a purist insight here of strengthening both ontic and discursive relations. The teacher says, possible change I would recommend. I've noticed students going from 100 to 200 level is a need for streamlining of expectations of what the instructors are assigning, because right now, basically teachers are teaching vastly different courses, and that we could streamline these courses in terms of just saying that students need to write 5,000 words of this or that, strengthen the ontic relations a bit and show that, and kind of more talk about the fact that, you know, they should be doing rhetorical analysis, causal arguments, academic arguments, annotated bibliographies, but strengthening the content a bit to create a little bit more streamlining. In terms of the cultivated gaze, so I really have been fascinated how this field sort of, the cultivated gaze can be used to sort of model or to create a rhetorical lens. So one teacher says, you know, it might just be my background, but, you know, it's really, I try to bring a sense of rhetorical awareness. Both of my courses, it's about developing rhetorical awareness of audience purpose, context, strategies, and media, and helping them develop successful messages within any community, and using rhetoric as a theory or a tool for that. So I think here, bringing in the community, it's much more about immersion into a cultivated gaze. And my last example is kind of this orientation to social justice that a lot of the teachers are bringing up. But I find it interesting that this orientation is more legitimated through a cultivated gaze. So one teacher says, 110 for 110, it's very much for me a social justice value of empowering these students to be able to succeed and have their voices heard and make a difference. And another teacher says, I agree. As a first generation college student, I also try to make things transparent, and being transparent, helping them navigate the university's expectations and demystifying the research process. So I think here, this is much more of a cultivated gaze of making visible the interactions, demystifying the process, as opposed to a social gaze. So kind of going on from here to kind of wrap up. So I think the doctrinal insight is really useful for providing this adaptable, portable toolkit for research and writing that can apply to 100 level and 200 level across the disciplines. But we might need, I think there might be some weakening of content and cohesion in the process, and that teachers and students are largely left responsible for strengthening ontic relations of content and context in their courses and disciplines. This might provide an example that there might be a no insight sort of going on there. In terms of the rhetorical or cultivated gaze, there's a rhetorical lens for analyzing and producing text situated within a community. And there's this social justice orientation about empowering students, transparency, demystifying the research process. At the same time, we're downplaying epistemic relations in favor of a model of writing based on immersion in the writing and research process, and not really kind of epistemic knowledge. And also subjective relations, though they are often a focus, I think as a basis are often downplayed. And I'm kind of seeing this in the data where different kinds of knowers are having difficulty accessing curriculum and technology. And also there's a huge push for anti-racist pedagogy. So I think we kind of need to bring in the subjective relations as well. So moving to the future, I want to use 4K to still more model this rhetorical lens, model the writing process, use it to analyze interaction in synchronous and asynchronous courses, strengthening content skills and principles, trying to help increase cumulative knowledge building between these courses, using LCT to sort of promote meta reflection and professional learning with teachers, which I think Cory will be kind of getting into that more. And then also just kind of trying to develop, in my context, a cuddly LCT for a student-centered learning context. So with that, I will stop there. I really appreciate everyone listening.
Great, thanks, Jason. So our third presentation is pre-recorded, so I'm going to pull that up in a minute. It's a presentation by Jennifer Walsh Marr at University of British Columbia, and hopefully we will get this working. Full screen. And let me know if the sound isn't loud enough.
On making knowledge visible to students. My name is Jennifer Walsh Marr, and I'm an English for academic purposes instructor at Vantage College at UBC, where during the 2020-2021 academic year, like many institutions around the world, we taught and studied remotely. This is the manner in which I've also been pursuing my PhD in language and literacy education at the University of Toronto's Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. So while on my radar for a bit previously, my first real introduction to LCT was part of the International SFL Conference in Boston in 2018, where I met several of the colleagues sharing with you today. Jody Martin has taken the initiative to set up an LCT-NA or North America group and nudge me towards using LCT in my EAP pedagogy. This is a brief representation of that work, and coming from the adage, if you want to learn it, teach it. So the context in which I teach is English for academic purposes to first-year undergraduate students at the University of British Columbia. Students are by definition all international students joining us for their first year of studies in a full course load with concomitant EAP discipline-specific support. Students come in at an intermediate English language level proficiency, and we do embedded discipline-specific genre and SFL-informed EAP pedagogy, and many of us with a quite critical orientation. So in the sections, or my sections of the course, I focused on the following. So developing students' meta-linguistic awareness, including legitimation code theory, semantics, to make features and knowledge visible to students working through another language and through another culture. I designed my lessons to be asynchronous so that they're accessible to students all around the world. I did a lot of work prioritizing practice and process over just performance. And I also incorporated a fair bit of group work as part of that enculturation and community building. So the way in which I introduced semantics in the lecture was I prepared a recorded lecture to introduce concepts situated within students' disciplinary contexts. These are several student-facing resources from my recorded lecture. The learning module also included several comprehension check activities in addition to the annotation and the writing work I'll share here. The key focus of the module was a focus on types of information, a simplified translation device, the exemplification of disciplinary text, and a warning against flatlining in students' writing. So I introduced with the lay terms for types of information that is more or less appropriate in different contexts, with a warning that sometimes when students get feedback that merely says vague, that is actually typically problematic. This is my student-facing simplified translation device, and a reminder that gravity is tied to a specific context, closely tethered to something in particular, whereas low or weak gravity means it is more abstract and covers a wider range of situations and examples. So this was just to show that there were different levels with different key points to them. More specifically, in incorporating the meta language introduced earlier in the course, I represented weak semantic gravity as things that are highly nominalized. Lots of details are omitted, that there's not a lot of contextual or circumstantial details to limit a context. And because we're dealing with academic literacy, a focus on citations and that they are summarizing several sources. So this is building on meta language that's SFL informed that was introduced previously and recontextualizing it in the context of semantic gravity. Next is the mid-range. It's not too heavy or tied to context, and yet it's not too abstract. And in my experience, this is a stage that a lot of novice writers miss. So a little bit of nominalization, some more modification. There may be definitions, explanations, and logic, and the like. And then strongest semantic gravity, being closely tied to context with more specificity, more elaboration, a lot more contextual, circumstantial information, and examples and specificity. So as the goal of this course is to highlight disciplinary usage of language in the student's discipline, this semantic waves lesson tied in really nicely to an assigned reading that the students had in their psychology course. And this particular text is on categorization as a form of cognitive development. And I won't read it to you here, but it's an introductory, and then it goes through, and I'll break it down as I did for the students. So pulled from the student's reading, I then separated out each of the sentences from that psych excerpt and asked students to apply the translation device that I shared with you to a familiar text, identifying what type of semantic gravity or what range each of these sentences represented. And then I shared my analysis and the rationale for the analysis with the students, tying back to that translation device. In order for the students to see the waves, I plotted those same sentences on a plane of semantic gravity. So we see up here, very weak semantic gravity, moving down to a definition, an instance, an example, waving up, waving down, and waving up again. What we see here is movement, or waves. This is an example from another text showing that it moves differently, but it's still waves. And that is an important takeaway, not to be prescriptive in how it must move, but that the movement, the existence of movement itself is quite important. The key takeaway for students is that they've got to move through ideas, Flatlining at strong semantic gravity with lots of examples but no discussion or ties to theory might earn them a comment like, so what? Flatlining up here with a weak semantic gravity can make it sound like someone's talking or name dropping of theories without really knowing what they're talking about. What we want to see instead is the blue movement through different levels. So after identifying semantic waves in others' work, the turn to purpose was for students' own writing and the instruction to make sure that they wave through a text. So using this to plan their assignments and reminding not to flatline. Waving down into some more specifics, my reminders incorporated some SFL meta language we worked on earlier in the course. So in order to wave up, they should nominalize. They connected to bigger ideas and theories and concepts and to summarize things. And how to wave down would be to add details, either through circumstances or circumstantiation and probe questions and pre and post modification within their noun groups. And again, that reminder not to forget the mid-range. Students then had comprehension activities to work through individually through our learning management system to confirm their understanding. And these are practice and ongoing activities that students were welcome to take until they scored 100% and demonstrated mastery. Students then worked with texts that they'd chosen in small groups to annotate with a social annotation platform called CLASS, or the Collaborative Learning Annotation System, a platform developed at University of British Columbia. It's quite similar to Hypothesis or Perusal, but it conforms to FIPO or Canadian privacy laws. Specific to the lesson on semantics, I encourage students to annotate with the following guidelines, looking for when an author waves up or waves down and using the hashtags to indicate that. Wondering if they can rework or unpack sentences with weak semantic gravity and make it easier to understand with more specificity, and again, incorporating previous lessons on grammatical metaphor for paraphrasing. Pointing to very specific sections of text that often have patterns for conclusions and introductions, whether they are weak or strong semantic gravity. And again, looking for that mid-range to see if there was much of those included. This is a screen capture of a group's annotations and conversation in the margins discussing the semantic waves. We've got some challenge with some of the nomenclature, whether it's small or weak semantic gravity, but we've also got some real engagement with the activity in terms of how to identify it and to respond to one another. In this example here, we've got students annotating features that help the text wave down. And how do they do it? To move or to wave down, adding more information and logic. In this example here, this time is from another module that was focusing on evaluation and argumentation, but the students make reference back to the previous module on semantic waves, indicating that they saw value in the concept. The last task of each unit was for students to write up what they noted in their annotation, work over several weeks, and make explicit connections between features and different texts. They had a group write in which to do this, again, making those connections between the individual modules, the annotations, and then synthesizing it. So in this one from a student here, we see some discussion of how we've got nominalization, how things are packed up, fewer circumstances. So specificity included here, and then summarizing it with reference to a neutral or mid-range semantic gravity for focusing and identifying an idea or concept, a little bit more description, and then what that means, that we see how the semantic waves go in this paragraph from low to high, and how and why it's functioning in that way. In this next excerpt here, summarizing towards the end, they're talking about the use of definitions and of the balance and how they start, and that there's waving in the paragraphs up and down, and this time using floating up and down. Again, more discussion from the same group about the semantic waves. And then this is in specific in a history text, talking about how this text begins with a long quote with a strong semantic gravity, very specific information, and then waves up to make connections to the previous examples and strong semantic gravity. So we see this movement and description not only with the semantics, but this discrete language features used to exemplify it. And finally here, this is a comparison of different disciplinary texts and their patterns, which is really the point of the course. So to look at how the beginning here, a student talks about how history text is the storytelling and narratives at a strong semantic gravity, whereas the geography text using case studies and examples and comparing the two of them. Strong semantic gravity and waves up in the analysis in the statements, whereas the geography texts beginning with abstract concepts and then waving down to come explanations and giving examples, so that there's important similarities and differences between these and how the waves manifest across the disciplines. What we see is students' uptake of semantic waves as a tool for analysis and revision, assisting in their academic literacy development. An extended version of this presentation is available through the LCT YouTube channel, and I'd like to thank you for your attention and welcome further conversation with my email attached. Thank you.
Okay. And I get to wrap up with the last presentation in session 33, Learning by Doing, LCA for Educators. Oops, let me get rid of that. There we go. Okay, so my talk is, let me start my timer here. There we go. LCT supporting justice-centered science education in the Lacunos project. I'm Cory Buxton, and I'm a professor in the College of Education at Oregon State University, USA. And this is an aspirational talk about work that I'm hoping to do over the next few years. I don't have data or analysis to share yet, but what I will share is the model that we've developed for this project, and LCT clearly has a role to play. I'm really hoping for suggestions and resources. I've gotten some great ones already from my LCT North America colleagues, and I know I've got plenty to read, but I am very much in the information gathering phase here. So Lacunos, the Language, Culture, and Knowledge Building Through Science project. This is an NSF-funded design and development study that runs for the next 3 years. On the design side, our work is to develop and test practices, tools, and model lessons that support 3 strands that we propose are important for science learning in the 21st century. And on the development side, our work is to provide ongoing professional learning and resources to science teachers primarily in rural and remote parts of Oregon to support their enactment of contemporary perspectives, both on science and on language. So I said 3 strands of the Lacunos project. What are those strands? Our first strand is language development for science sense making. And for each of these strands, there's sort of a challenge that we see and a goal we have to try to overcome it. The challenge we see on this one is we know that students use language to represent not only what they know, but also who they are in relation to science. And that might sound a bit SFL-y to folks, that very much is, in this sense that we know we need to help students learn to use language in explicit and conscious ways to make sense of science in their lives if we want to overcome that first challenge. Our second strand of Lacunos is mapping cultural and community connections to science. So the challenge we see there is we know that many students don't see their cultures, their communities, or their histories represented in science, either in school or in society. And if we want to overcome that, we know we need to foster students' science interest and identity through seeing and building personal connections to science and why it matters to them. And that leads us to our third strand, which is very much a knowledge building strand with a focus on informed decision making. The challenge that we frame is that scientific understanding is only useful to people when we see the connections among concepts and also the connections to meaningful contexts. So our goal should be to apply evidence-based explanations to the kind of daily decisions and justice-centered solutions to social challenges. So lots of issues, lots of challenges, but hopefully some resources to help us think about it. I want to take us on a quick autonomy tour, get us out of sort of the mode of Lacunos into sort of two other pieces of work that I've been involved in recently, because I'm very much an LCT noob. That's probably clear already. I'm very much in a learning around LCT mode, but I do have some other strengths and resources that I bring. With my colleague Oki Lee, I just completed a pretty comprehensive literature review on multilingual learners in science education from 2014 to the present. We saw very clearly that there are some substantive changes going on in science education driven by a new generation of frameworks in Europe, in Canada, in the US, around the world. And there's a shift from what we frame as traditional perspectives to more contemporary perspectives, both in science and on the language side. So on the science side, some of those shifts are a shift from a central focus on science concepts that sort of scientists have nominated to a central focus on making sense of phenomenon and the kind of work that scientists do. In other words, knowledge in use. Another example is the traditional side of science is focusing on looking at students' prior knowledge to identify what used to be misconceptions, then we said alternative conceptions. But the more contemporary view is really thinking about prior knowledge as a way to leverage the resources, cultural and linguistic, and the interest and identities towards science that students bring. On the language side, we found there are some clear trends, but also a lot less agreement that at least in the linguists who are the linguistic folks who are working in the science world, there are still a lot of folks talking about academic language as dichotomous from everyday language. There's still a lot of focus on what I think of as linguistic modalities rather than multimodal. And of course, in applied linguistics, there's lots of work in these contemporary perspectives, but what we found in our lit review is they're not making it into the science literature. So this work exists, but it's not crossing over. And one third example, there's still a lot of work on sheltered instruction to support English language development, rather than the contemporary view of translanguaging to support sort of multilingual language development. So there's a lot of work, we would say, in science ed that is not fully contemporary, and we think there's some ways that LCT might help us get there in some of these areas. And to continue the autonomy tour a tiny bit more, we also, with my colleague Oki and I, we have an in-press essay titled Justice-Centered Science Education, where we're proposing a conceptual framework that moves beyond some of these existing frameworks to more center justice issues, and particularly the way minoritized groups have not been served well by science and engineering and technology in society. So our model of a justice-centered science education highlights three things. It addresses pressing societal challenges. It leverages the convergence of multiple subjects that are needed to explain those societal challenges, and it designs justice-centered solutions. So we need approaches, practical approaches. This is all pretty theoretical. We need practical approaches to work with teachers to help them think about how we create a more justice-centered science education. So why do we use tools, practices, and model lessons as the way we frame this work? Well, partly because I've got a fair amount of training in cultural anthropology, and I fully believe that we've learned and progressed as humans largely through the development and use of tools for solving problems. And we learn to use new tools and practices when we see new problems, and those can help us see new possibilities for ourselves in relation to solving those problems. We know we need to expand linguistic, cultural, and knowledge-building tools that students possess if we're really going to have a justice-centered solutions to problems that haven't been justice-centered in the past. And we begin by embedding these tools and practices and model lessons to train teachers with the hope, and then they take the tools and practices and apply them to other sorts of lessons. So two questions: where's the LCT in all this, and sort of what are the tools and practices? So this is our current evolving Lacunos model, and we think of it sort of as a wave up. So band one at the bottom, this is where we started with teachers, because these are practices that are probably more accessible and easier for teachers to conceptualize and think about what they look like. And they already do some of these things in their classroom. And so we've got sort of the 3 bands and then the 3 strands. So in band 1, on the language strand, we worked on sort of choosing language based on topic, purpose, and audience, very much an SFL approach. And we developed some practical tools to help teachers do this. On the cultural and community connection side, really looking at how we group students around science and our goals, and how do we use role play and other sort of tools to help students think about where they see science in their communities and their families. And on the knowledge building side, we worked on, of course, creating the kinds of phenomenon and experiences that help students think about how does knowledge get built and accepted. So it's actually in the knowledge building strand that LCT, and particularly specialization, pops up kind of early, because this idea about how knowledge is built and expressed clearly is about legitimation and how we legitimate knowledge in a field like science. We are moving now into band 2 with the teachers this year. So we've been working on translanguaging and multimodal pedagogies and tools for supporting that on the language side. We've been working on rethinking the way we do family science nights and family events to create more co-learning opportunities for kids, families, kids, parents, and teachers to work together on science. And we've been talking a lot about place-based and building social relationships through science as a way to support knowledge relationships in science, which again, hopefully has an LCT flavor to it. And we are moving towards where we haven't gotten yet in the sort of next year's work. So that's why I'm building resources, is band 3 is clearly where LCT is front and center. On the language development side, clearly semantic waving. We've broached this a little bit with teachers, but semantic waving is clearly one way we want them to think about language for science sense making, and looking at some simple wave maps as sort of a tool for planning. On the culture and community strand, this is where we see autonomy touring potentially being really useful. How do we think about the examples, experiences? So funds of knowledge, in older ways, traditional ways we've thought about these cultural community connections, I think can really be enriched by bringing sort of the autonomy code to this work and thinking about it in that way with teachers. And then, of course, knowledge building strand is at this level about thinking about epistemic relationships and some tools. We're interested in using paired concept maps and thinking about how that might help us see students' emergent knowledge and also help them be a sort of a multimodal space for them to make arguments about what counts, what's legitimate in their argument for social problems. And again, aiming this all towards social problems. So as one example of what this looks like in practice, so these model lessons I've talked about, one model lesson we developed very timely on spreading infectious diseases, and then a follow-up lesson which is on vaccines and the Swiss cheese model of community protection. So this spreading infectious disease model uses 2 simulations. One is a computer simulation where they plug various scenarios into a spreadsheet that models spread of disease given the reproduction number and time. And then we do a hands-on simulation where we actually get to see how disease spreads and play epidemiologist and try to track it back and figure out who patient 0 was. So this is an example. This leads to lots of conversations about justice-centered solutions. How has our COVID response in the US? Certainly we can look around the world, but in the US, there's lots of ways that it was not justice-centered in how it was rolled out. And kids have a lot to say about that. So that's an example of how we're using model lessons to prompt conversation with kids and with teachers to hopefully think about how we build a more justice-centered science ed. So how can LCT support the goals of Lacunos and support this justice-centered work? I'm really interested in sort of thoughts about how LCT thinking and strategies can support the design side of our work, which is about, of course, developing and testing practices, tools, and models. We need some tools. Obviously, LCT has a lot of tools. I need to get them in a sort of a format that will work for our teachers. On the development side, how can LCT thinking provide sort of support our ongoing professional learning? How do we talk LCT to teachers, science teachers, in a way that resonates with them? And of course, any other suggestions folks have for how I can use and our team can use LCT to help us better shape the work across these three strands of the kudos. So don't need backup slides. So that is my presentation. I'm gonna stop sharing, and we've got about 5 minutes for questions for any of the presenters. And we thank you very much for joining this session. And questions or comments?
I think we've hit the perfect amount of time where it's a little bit too late for Europe and South Africa and a little bit too early for Australia and Asia. And everyone's either fading or faded or coming to life. But great to see everybody's work all together and back to back. We so often spend each week talking about one topic. Seeing them back to back really shows the parallels and complementarities with all the projects. So nothing to say other than.
And I think we're excited in LCT North America to push this work forward, especially a lot of this applied work. It's cool that I think it's cool that many of us are doing very applied work with teachers and students, and it's a good group. I can say as a newbie and a newcomer to the group, it's a very supportive and welcoming group.
So Jason, I have a question for yours.
Mhm.
As someone who is inside that discipline, I was just like, your analysis seemed spot on. So kudos to that, to you on that. I did want to ask you, you had mentioned in one of your slides that the discipline is that rhetoric and composition as a discipline kind of resists being pigeonholed in terms of content, that it's constantly reinventing itself. And I wanted to, I've had conversations with other rhetoricians and had much the same kind of like analysis of the situation. And I wanted to throw this out there and see what you think of it. What if they're not reinventing themselves or finding or creating ambiguity in their disciplinary practices, but are actually discovering ambiguity that is already there? The idea that language is ambiguous, there are multiple signifieds for any particular sign, and so this is kind of a natural outgrowth of that kind of deconstructionist orientation.
That might be a much more productive way to look at it. And the redefining all the time, that's like kind of the narrative they tell themselves. It's the focus, right? But I was looking at it in a sort of cynical way, and from a more productive way, they always are finding ambiguities, which could be a positive thing. Is that what you're that's a new way to look at it?
I just I've also been critical of this tendency in the past, but when I tried to understand it and have like a listening conversation, as kind of Jody was talking about, privileging listening as my dominant orientation towards that conversation, I was more aligned than I thought I was with this seems like a natural a natural outgrowth of a rhetorical orientation towards the world, exploring the various meanings in various discourses. Oh, jeepers, there's ambiguity. Like, what did we expect?
Sure. So the process too is like always evolving. And I think that at least goes with the interactional relations perhaps, and also strengthening the discursive relations. So thank you for that. That's a much more productive kind of way of looking at it, of continuing to explore instead of just redefining for legitimacy, right? It's a great point. Thank you.
Right on the nose, right on the hour. That's what we've got from LCT North America.